In this presentation, I decided to hit two birds with one stone. On the one hand, I'm going to examine the representations of writing tools and materials on the Phrygian door stelae, which is a unique type of funeral monument and which contains a considerable number of these kinds of depictions. On the other, I want to scrutinize an extraordinary writing material also represented on these door stelae, a very special kind of codex. Sir William Ramsay wrote in 1884, "Two kinds of sepulchral monuments were commonly used in Phrygia in the Roman times. One is a slab of marble or other stone carved to imitate a doorway. The doorposts, the two valves, the lintel, and generally a pointed or rounded pediment above are all indicated. One or two knockers are usually carved on the door, and symbols referring to the ordinary life of the deceased person are often represented on the panels, a basket, a strigil, a mirror, or something of the kind. I have seen many hundred gravestones of this kind in every part of Phrygia, in Galatia, and in Pisidia. These stelae were most commonly referred to as thura, or door. To quote Sir Ramsay again, the door was the passage communication between the world of life and the world of death. The altar was the place on which the living placed the offerings due to the dead." In his monograph, Mark Wilkins has assembled all the known examples of door stones and has defined and categorized regional groups, workshops, and their styles. Nonetheless, the origin, meaning, and function of these grave types with door facades remain very much open questions. Originally, the stelae may have been erected at the entrances of tumuli, and they should be understood as the invented tradition of the newly emerging elites in recently founded cities, serving to legitimate their status as elites and to prove the nobility of their city, as argued by Ute Kelp. In the 1st century CE, door facades appear as parts of the ostentatious graves of Phrygian urban elites. Over the course of the 2nd century CE, they become much more widespread and were found as far as eastern Phrygia, and they began to be used in more modest grave types, primarily grave stelae. The main problem is that most door stones were subsequently reused, and one only rarely comes across on the original context of which is known. The use of door stones reached its peak towards the end of the 2nd century CE and the beginning of the 3rd, when they become the dominant feature of many, including the most typical of funerary monuments in eastern Phrygia. In spite of all their formal differences, most door stones of Roman Phrygia carry depictions of various objects from everyday life, symbolizing gender, profession, and the status of the deceased, among them items like book rolls and strigils, alluding to the literacy and the word of palestra, in short, the Greek paideia. Again, regional variations have been observed. In more developed cities like Aizanoi or Philomelion, these objects are less frequently found than in rural areas such as the Tembris Valley. Especially with respect to the objects advertising paideia, the question of real-life use has been raised. Do these monuments really provide an accurate picture of the levels of literacy and urbanized lifestyles of the rural population? Yet it seems irrational to deny these visual depictions of paideia any relationship to real life, while accepting the realistic representation of professions through the depictions of tools, livestock, and so forth. The reliefs on door monuments reveal a world of peasants and craftsmen, but also the self-awareness of citizens, even if the latter may have been more ambition than reality in some regions. In his 1986 catalogue, Mark Wilkins published 807 door stelae. They contained a total of 144 depictions of writing tools and materials, which I evaluated using a computer database. Unfortunately, the Schreibgeräte were only superficially treated in Wilkins' catalogue. According to him, I quote, "The education is often mentioned on men's graves, but it can be observed that these motifs were very popular in the countryside. For instance, on the Altintas plain and on the borderland of Phrygia and Lycaonia. The rural population here not only emphasized the importance of literary culture in the decorations on their tombstones, but also expressed pride in Hellenization in naming." Our main research question was not simply what kinds of writing tools and materials are represented on the Phrygian door stelae and in what proportion, but also where are they located on the grave monuments. I hoped that this research would provide relevant answers to the quantitative and qualitative questions of literalization in Roman Central Anatolia. The representations can be found on the following 6 parts of the door stelae: frame, tympanum, and the 4 panels. I was able to distinguish depictions of 10 kinds of writing tools and materials: the single writing tablet, the open diptych, both portrait and landscape form, the polyptych with a strap, the open scroll, the closed scroll, scrolls bound together, the codex with hinge and horn, the stylus and pen, and the pen case. 70% of the depictions of writing materials are found on the door panels, while the remaining 30% are located in the frame and tympanum. As regards the 4 panels of the 2 door leaves, 51% of the depictions were located on the left door leaf, and 19% were found on the lower and upper panels of the right door leaf. The most common place for depictions of writing instruments is the lower left panel with 30%. It would be tempting to assume that the left and right door leaves correspond to the male and female side, as is persuasive on this monument. Next to the men's portrait, there is an open diptych in the frame, a pen case on the top left panel of the door leaf, and a plough on the bottom right panel. In contrast, the wife is depicted with cosmetic utensils and a basket with this stuff. Naturally, the latter objects are the accessories of femininity, while the plough clearly refers to a male occupation. Based on this, we could assume that since the writing instruments are also on the male side, they also refer to an occupation which was understood as male. However, the situation is not entirely clear. There are no male or female portraits on most door stelae. We have an easier time with the numerical distribution of the 10 types of writing tools and materials. Writing boards lead. Diptychs comprise 28% of the depictions. Writing tablets comprise 5%, and the polyptych with a strap comprises 2%, or 35% all of the depictions in total. In contrast, the papyrus roll comprises 24% of the depictions, although the pen case, which comprises 27% of the depictions, is ahead of it. Finally, the third most common depiction, the Codex, comprises 10% of the depictions. Despite this relatively small ratio, this book format will still be the subject of more discussion in today's presentation. As I mentioned above, the diptych, or 2-leaved tablet, is the most commonly represented writing material on the Phrygian door stelae. It is impossible to decide whether the depictions are images of wax tablets or wooden boards. Their size and orientation also vary. According to the secondary literature, diptychs and codices are related to the activity of writing, which doesn't mean that they have nothing to do with high literature or poetic activity. The tablets are usually found on the male side of the door stelae. Therefore, we can assume that they could also refer to manly professions such as animal husbandry, crafts, or trade. The frequency of representations of diptychs may indicate the prevalence of literacy in the rural areas of 2nd century and 3rd century Phrygia. One of the most important tools for scribes was the pen case or graphiarium, which could be made of leather or metal. Its Latin name, the Theca calamaria, indicate that it was used for keeping reed pens. The term teca cannarum quinque in Diocletian's price edict also indicates that usually 5 pence were kept in a teca. It is a very common motif on Phrygian funerary reliefs. Its number only slightly exceeds by the number of diptychs, and it is almost always found near a closed or open scroll. Moreover, there is a typical motif on which the teca is depicted upon an open scroll. All this underscores that the scrolls refer not only to the activity of reading, but also to of writing, especially when they are depicted together with a pen case. It is also worth noting that styluses are usually depicted alone or in pairs next to a diptych. Open and closed scrolls denote written books made of papyrus or, less frequently, pergamon or vellum. The scrolls can be open in the middle, open on the one side, or closed, namely rolled up in one or a single double column. Depictions of scrolls are traditionally connected to the activity of writing. Scrolls are usually connected with depictions of pen cases, thus we cannot rule out the possibility that volumen refers to literary production as well. Nevertheless, it is highly probable that the main vehicles of everyday writing were the waxed or wooden tablets, and the more expensive papyrus scrolls were tied to a more prestigious activity. The question also arises as to whether scrolls could refer to the Bible in the case of Christian funerary monuments. In my opinion, the sources available so far do not provide adequate evidence of this. On the funerary bomus of Eutropius, one finds a depiction of a pen case and an open scroll. According to this metrical epitaph, the freedman Eutropius sought to demonstrate his knowledge of classical culture, Sophies metron mega. The pen case and the papyrus scroll emphasizes his knowledge visually, in Peter Toneman's opinion. But we are also informed by the eulogy that Eutropius, I quote, had a listening God whom he yearned for, eikegar kai theon epekon hon pepoteke. Although the listening God doesn't necessarily refer to the God of Christians, the verb pothein has strong Judeo-Christian connotations, as does the closing formula. And if Eutropius was a Christian, why would the scroll not refer to the Bible? There is a peculiar kind of codex represented on Phrygian reliefs, which so far has been wrongly defined in the secondary literature, as far as I know, of course. I gave it the working title Codex with Hinge and Horn. More than 100 years ago, the esteemed German archaeologist Theodor Wiegand described this object, which he had observed on a grave altar or a bomus at Thyatira, as follows, I quote, "This object is very important for our understanding of ancient books. This is a scroll rolled up on one side, the right side of which must be understood as a hinge, in German Rollenstag, which protruded in a horn-like curve. This is known for writers and poets, but first appears here on a monument," end of quote. Unlike polyptychs, the frames of which were perforated on the longer side, as we saw it in Csaba Szabó's and Ernest Szabó's lecture, and the tablets which were tied with a cord. This peculiar kind of codex was represented with a lock and a hinge, which end in a horn-like protrusion, as you can see on the slide. Although polyptychs could also have locks, such as the lock on the polyptych that was found at Aquileia, the use of the hinge is a completely novelty in the Roman age. Considering that the examples of this kind of codex has been found in the famous Uluburun shipwreck from the 14th century, from the Bronze Age, and Assyria from the 7th century BCE. Editors of the MAMA, or Monumenta Asiae Minoris Antiqua, interpret it as, I quote, a closed diptychon with a strap. And Welkens refers to it as a geschlossenes Diptychon mit Riemen, but this is, as far as I see, obviously wrong. As a matter of fact, this kind of codex was widespread not only in Asia Minor, as you can see these two depictions on reliefs from Asia Minor, but also in the Western provinces. We also saw in one of the lectures this funerary altar from Aquileia, as well as on this bronze statuette of an artisan with a writing tablet tucked in his belt. This is from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, New York. Unfortunately, I do not know of any surviving specimens of this type of codex. The only exception is the so-called Bacillides Codex, il Libro di Basilide, which is on display at the Museo Nazionale delle Terme di Diocleziano in Rome. This codex, which is made of lead and which I had the opportunity to examine in person in this August, is probably of late antique origin and contains some encrypted Gnostic texts on 7 pages, also made of lead. These pages were put into a 9 by 12 centimeter case, which forms the top and the bottom cover of the codex. The lower and upper cases are held together by a hinge containing a rod. On this rod, or perhaps we should call it an axis, we find 14 rings, small rings, to which the pages were attached. And why do I call this an exception of exceptions among the codices? Because in my opinion, this method was not suitable for inserting sheets of wood, parchment, or papyrus. Hinged polyptychs were assembled differently, not to mention papyrus or parchment codices. And we will return to the question of the handle soon. The fifth most popular writing material on the Phrygian door stelae is the single writing tablet. Romans used relatively big writing boards. This was a whitewashed table with varnish or lime, which was used by the magistrates to publish their official documents, decrees, edicts, or other public notices inscribed in black. The tables or notice boards of judicial magistrates, praetors, aediles, etc., were fundamental because they established the principles that they would follow in their work as administrators of justice. But as the Herculaneum wall paintings show, it could even have been used for private purposes. The writing instruments in sixth place are the pens and styluses. Roman stelae were mainly used to write on wax tablets, but they were also used on other surfaces such as lead and wood. They were mostly made of metal, with iron and copper alloys being most commonly used materials. Early Roman stelae are made of bone, and they are not usually found after the 1st century CE. Wooden stelae are known from late Roman and Coptic Egypt, and they must have existed in other places as well. There are also objects with a wooden shank and a metal spiral nib, frequently called Vindolanda type pens, which were used with ink at Vindolanda, but which also would have been suitable for use as stelae or stylus-like tools. On Phrygian reliefs, stelae were usually depicted alongside the diptychs, but ink pens are also found, though rarely accompanied by open and closed scrolls. The last writing material on which I touch is the presentation of the polyptych with a strap, which can be found both in central Anatolia and the western provinces. As we saw above, many scholars think that the Codex Ansatus is a polyptych bound together and hanged down from a strap. As a matter of fact, leather cases with which to carry writing tablets have been found in archaeological settings, but they didn't have straps. At least 2 finds have been identified as leather cases for tablets, one from Vindolanda and one from Vindonissa. And there are further possible examples from the United Kingdom. They are almost identical, shaped like a small box, probably with a longer piece of leather on one side which served as the lid. There are no signs of handles. However, on the majority of representations of polyptychs with straps, the tables can clearly be seen. Consequently, they were not put into a leather case. As you see in this slide, the pieces of wooden tablets are clearly seen. Moreover, we are aware of many funerary reliefs, both in the east and the west, on which polyptychs furnished with a lock have been carried and or hanged in a sack with a strap. It is especially common among school children. The Latin word ansa literally means handle, and of course a strap can also be a handle, but the aforementioned horned codices probably can also be interpreted as codices ansati or codexes with a handle. My aim with this review was in part to examine individual writing instruments based on occurrence statistics of the Phrygian door stelae. Of course, based on this, it would not be correct to state that in Phrygia more writing boards were used than papyrus scrolls, as during the evaluation of the data, other aspects must also be taken into account, for example, the funeral context or the connections with working life. At the same time, the writing boards have been used for literary and even religious purposes, for example, fortune telling or divination, as it will be shown in an article which will appear in the next issue of the academic journal Chiron, published in Munich. The case of Codex Ansatus and Codex with Hinge and Horn draws attention to the fact that we do not yet know everything about the development of the Codex form, so further research will be needed on this issue. Thank you very much for your attention.